Hello, and I welcome you all to today's Kaleidoscope session. I am Shubhangi, and I lead the branding and communication efforts at And Academy. I'm so happy to have all of you here. Thank you for taking out the time to just like be with us. I hope you all get to learn something new today, and then also have some fun while doing that. Um, so, before diving right into the conversation with Sahil, I would like to talk a little bit about what we do here at AND. Um, AND Academy is the brainchild of Dr. Jitin Chadda, who's the founder and CEO of IIAD and Academy. So, IIAD is an offline design college based in New Delhi, Okhla. The likes of your bachelor's in design is what you find there, but um, and Academy actually came up as a need to impart design education online, which is when COVID hit. So we've been around for 3 years, but IIAD has been around for like over a decade. So and actually comes from that pedigree of IIAD and having imparted design education for over a decade now. The system of disseminating design education online was perfected over the 2 years of COVID with IIED students and then rolled out as an academy. But what is the difference between IIED and is that we offer professional short courses in the domains of graphic, interior, and UI UX. And all of these courses are designed for people um, that are working professionals or say cannot commit to a full-time course and are looking for part-time courses. So all of most of our courses are part-time courses. We have one full-time course in graphic design, but other courses are part-time courses. Um, we teach with the convenience of offline with the convenience of online with the effectiveness of offline. So everything that you find in an offline design school is what you'll find here at and just in an online fashion. So think about a typical design studio or a design classroom, your trits, your group discussions, your juries, your feedback, your portfolio creation, all of that you do in a design classroom, you do that at hand also, but in an online manner. We rely heavily on tech and on human support to achieve this sort of learning model. Um, I've already spoken about the fact that we come from the pedigree of IIAD. All of our curriculum is also designed by people that are industry practitioners. So they're actively part of the design industry and also academicians. So these are top educators and designers in the country that you get to sort of network with and learn from while you're in the course. These courses are also delivered by these people only. I've already spoken about the live and interactive fashion of our courses. At and we focus on a lot of design processes and principles and not just software rote learning. So you do get to learn your tools and your software, your Photoshop and the Figmas and the CADs of the world, whatever is relevant for your domain, you will get to learn that. But what is it that you do with that software? What is it that you design on those software is what we teach here at AND. So how to think like a designer, how to break down a design brief into a problem solving approach. How do you do that? That is what you sort of learn at AND. Uh, all of our curriculum is also sort of woven with these projects. So you learn a module, say, for example, you learn about color theory or spatial design, and then you work on a project which sort of talks about the real life application of these theories or principles. So you learn by doing, and then you get feedback from your peers, your mentors. You have one-on-one sessions with both of these people. There's group discussion, group project. So you're learning with a cohort and also one-on-one with a mentor. So you get the best of both worlds. And eventually, all of your projects culminate into a portfolio. So as soon as you hit the ground running, you have something that you can sort of showcase for the entire length and breadth of your course, uh, which becomes your portfolio. We also have a lot of faith in the quality of design education that we provide, that you get career support, best in class career support, and job guarantee. And what does that entail is that you work with a dedicated career services team to build your LinkedIn profile, your resume, your portfolio. You have interview prep. uh, what is you have mock tests, mock interviews, so everything that you would sort of um, go through. You learn how to write emails also, so they're like soft skills also you build. So everything that is required for you to sort of land a job, you get prepped for that. And we also offer job guarantee for some of our courses, which is basically that if you're not placed within 6 months of your graduation, we will refund your fee, given that you also meet the criteria of attendance and submissions. So that's about that. We've been around for 3 years. We have a community of over 1,200 plus learners, 50 plus mentor body, 200 plus industry connects, and we are rated 4.6 on Google. So if any of you want to sort of join one of our courses, please feel free to write to us, to call us. You can find the number on the website. I can drop the link in the chat later. That is about an academy. Coming to Kaleidoscope, it is conceptualized as a series of talks, masterclasses, discussions, where we invite people from the design industry to sort of share their perspective on design. Today we have with us Sahil. Sahil is a experienced designer at user experience designer at Adobe. Um, He's a human-centered designer passionate about shaping experiences that are empathetic, explorative, and persuasive. With the process rooted in research and holistic thinking, he approaches every challenge as an opportunity to solve problems creatively and meaningfully. His design journey has instilled in him empathy, perseverance, and an eye for detail, qualities that fuel his mission to create interactions that go beyond aesthetics and enable cognitive, emotional, and social fulfillment. For Sahil, design is not just about solutions, but about building connections that truly matter. With that, I will hand over to Sahil. Sahil, please take over.
Thank you so much for the wonderful introduction, Shubhangi. And I'll just quickly get started with sharing the screen. Yep. Hope this is visible.
Yeah.
Awesome. So, as we begin, first and foremost, I'd love to thank you all for joining amidst this Friday evening and for taking out your precious time to be a part of this conversation. And for and Academy, especially Shubhangi, for reaching out and helping set this entire conversation up. Very excited to see how this pans out and would love to hear all of your thoughts at the end of it. As we get started, it is important for us to first acknowledge what exactly is the topic that we are here for. What exactly is it that we are going to be discussing? What exactly is it that we are going to take back from this conversation, right? And for me, that is going to be these three P's. Now, you all might be wondering, why exactly do they look different to each other? What does each P stand for? Is there any hidden meaning attached to it? Is this a secret code? For me, this is my answer to the art of crafting captivating narratives, or the art of creating stories that can engage and interest an audience effectively. Before we get started, before we turn the pages and find out each and every chapter of what encapsulates the three P's, I'd love to just start with a brief introduction about myself. So, my name is Sahil, and I've been a user experience designer too at Adobe for the last 3 years, where I primarily work on this group of products called Experience Cloud. So while you all might be aware of the Creative Cloud, which entails products like Illustrator and Photoshop, which we as designers are quite accustomed to, there is a second cloud which is known as Document Cloud, which deals with products such as Acrobat and PDF. And there is a tertiary one which is known as Adobe Experience Cloud, which mainly deals with Adobe's enterprise B2B offerings. So it's a conglomerate of over 19 products. And the one that I particularly focus on is known as Adobe Journey Optimizer, which mainly deals with creating or serving the marketeers to create customer journeys, content ranging from a push notification to an email, and so on. Before that, as I graduated, I also parallelly got the chance to be part of institutions such as Samsung R&D and Ernst& Young. And it's been an extremely fulfilling and exciting journey through and through. Now, it's also important to understand that while we discuss that this entire conversation is going to be about the art of storytelling, why exactly are stories relevant to us? Why exactly are they important to us as designers? So when we talk about design, whether it's user experience design, it's visual communication, product design, physical or industrial design, All of them can be looked at as experiences. The only difference is the mode of interaction. So, for example, in case of dealing with a UI UX based app, a digital interface, my interaction there is going to be through clicks. On the other hand, if there is a physical product like a mobile phone, outer surface, external surface, or even say a scooty, car, automotive design, all of that also entails a different kind of interaction which is more physical in nature. Similarly, even if you look at visual communication, whether you're talking about branding or packaging design, those are more visual experiences. But all in all, these are essentially experiences which leave an impact on the users. But our jobs as designers is not just to create and craft these experiences, but to also drive them forward through stories, to take them and to magnify their impact by bringing them in their most vivid form to their users. What this allows is to not only create a connection, but also create a sense of fulfillment for the users where they feel strongly and they feel more attached to the entire idea of that experience. They feel more fulfilled going through it. And which is exactly where we get started with today's conversation. Where before we get to the very first chapter, I'd love for you all to take a deep breath. And as you do so, in front of you, the visual you can see is that of the universe. As vast, as magnanimous as it may seem, it might be of fascination to you to note that all of this beautiful surreal vastness actually came from what appeared to be this tiny speck of dust at a point. It used to be a small fraction of what now your imagination of the universe is. And then there was suddenly the Big Bang, an event which transformed that tiny speck of dust into what we perceive today as the vast, magnanimous universe that we looked at in the first picture. Why exactly are we discussing this story? It is to understand the very first P of the three P's that we initially saw. And this is what brings us to the very first chapter, which is that of plot lines. Now, a plotline in simpler terms is the structure of the narrative that you have to create as a designer around your story. And this encapsulates different aspects, different elements, where we'll go through each of them one by one. Starting with the very first being to craft a narrative structure, it is important for you as a designer to identify what is the intent, what is the purpose of the story that you are telling. This is where I bring in a framework created by Dan Rome, who is a philosopher around storytelling and technical communication and is a very respected person in the industry who drives a lot of thought leadership around stories. In his framework, he talks about four different types of story arcs. A story arc is essentially how a story is moving forward. He talks about how each story essentially has a beginning, a middle, and the end. Just in case of what we were discussing earlier, where the Big Bang was what happened in the middle, and that is exactly what brought the audience, which is us who are looking at it, from this tiny speck to what we today know as the universe. Dan Rome talks about four different types of story arcs, where each of them are catering to a different purpose, to a different intent. If we talk about the very first one, it is a more straightforward format of storytelling, where it's essentially just conveying information to the user, to the audience, where at the end of it, the goal or the purpose is to leave them with an increased sense of information. This particular story arc is known as a report. As designers, this is something which might be of relevance in instances where we want to present information without maligning it with any bias. So, for example, in case of any user research that you conduct, in case of any market research that you conduct, when you're presenting observations, those observations are not reflecting your bias. So, which is why those observations would ideally be in the form of information that is conveyed to the users. It can be in form of data, it can be in form of text, and so on. The second form of story arc is where we would want to not just provide information to our audience, but also leave them with an increased sense of ability, where the flow of the story is more layer by layer, where we start with simpler concepts and then slowly get into the complexities of it, so that by the end of it, the audience leaves with not just information, but also an increased sense of ability, an increased sense of having confidence that they can now apply that information into actually using that as an ability in fulfilling their tasks. The second story arc is known as an explanation. So this is the form of a story arc which you could utilize when you're dealing with different stakeholders, when you're working with engineers, product managers, having to explain why you took a certain design decision. Even as design students, when you're interacting with your faculty, when you're presenting in the jury, there are certain times where you're questioned about why you did a certain thing a certain way. That is exactly where you would want to use this kind of a story arc, where you explain the audience of the rationale behind certain decisions. The third form of story arc is something that we would have all been accustomed to through this popular TV show known as Shark Tank, where at the beginning uh, the participants come and they start by sharing how there is a problem, which can be a hurdle that can further be solved through this solution, right? So you as the audience might be facing this hurdle. How do you exactly come over that? How do you succeed over that? And this is known as a pitch. In corporate, it is something that you can utilize when you're dealing with leadership conversations, when you're presenting as a design showcase, when you want to highlight why a certain project or a certain feature can solve a problem or solve a hurdle that otherwise existed for the customers or for the business. Similarly, this is something which you can use as an alternative form of showcase when, as students, you are given certain assignments and you want to highlight how what you've come up with is solving that particular assignment. How is it in that context? Now, coming to the fourth story arc, which is that of a drama. Now, this is something which is very popularly adapted in a lot of movies, whether you talk about Harry Potter or Star Wars or even The Lord of the Rings. The entire concept of how initially there is a protagonist who go through a difficult journey where at one point in the story they're at the very bottom, and from there on there is a disruption which leads them to an onward trajectory, which at the end of it leads the audience with an instilled sense of happiness. And this is something which is not just conveying information, not just explaining the audience, not just leaving them with a sense of fulfillment of the task that they wanted to achieve, but also with an emotional impact of feeling joy. This is exactly where we get concluded with the four different types of story arcs. And that brings us to the next concept of, now that we've identified the purpose or the intent of coming up with a story, what is the emotional impact that we want to leave our audience with? It is important to identify whether you want to leave your audience with, say, an increased sense of curiosity, an increased sense of wonder. Do you want them to feel fulfilled that, oh, they came in seeking a particular information and they leave exactly knowing just that? Do you want them to leave with a sense of surprise that, oh, I came in expecting something else, but now I end up leaving with something that I earlier did not envision could be a part of this presentation, right? And this is exactly where we end up dealing with emotions. As soon as you are able to identify at the very beginning that this is the kind of emotional impact that I want to leave the audience with, you are able to not just tell your story to the audience, but also take them along with you in that journey. You are allowed to make that story or that experience a lot more immersive for your audience, allowing you to craft the entire world of that story or that narrative in a manner where it is completely immersing the audience within it and it is completely surrounding them within that context. And that is where we talked about a bit of how you can shape a narrative structure, right? How you can shape a plot line. But at the same time, a plot line also brings in the concept of content. What is the kind of content that you would want to infuse your plot line with? Now you're aware that this is the kind of a story structure. Probably I want to use a report, I want to use say a drama. But within that, what is the kind of content that I come up with? Whatever presentation you're dealing with or whatever story you want to narrate, it is always important to make sure that as designers, whatever information you are providing is novel. It is not something that the same audience has been privy to. It is not something that you are borrowing from another place. That is where the difference between copying and being inspired comes in, right? Even if it is referring to an occurrence that happened, it is important for you to not just share the occurrence but also highlight how it impacted you, what is your perspective around it. And while that is what makes the content novel, the second step is to also adapt that content to the context of that audience. So for example, the same story that I am presenting to two different audiences would require me to change certain things. So for example, if this same presentation I was giving to a audience which was not virtual but was physically present, the way I would have presented would have added a bit more physicality. So for example, gestures and moving around in the physical space and so on. What is the duration that I have to base my entire presentation or my entire story in? What is the time that my audience would be joining in? What are the kind of references that might resonate with them? For example, I presented the same conversation in a university in Michigan, where I realized that there were certain references that they might not connect with because that is more rooted in the Indian context. So, which is exactly where it becomes important to identify the context. And once you do that, you're able to create different variations of your story in a manner where each audience that you might cater to would get the chance of experiencing a new version of that same story. And just to showcase an example of how this entire idea of plot lines can be applied to storytelling, I'd love to share this piece that I created of a design showcase, which was more of an internal event at Adobe. I'll just share this tab. So just to set some context, this is an event known as Adobe Design Summit, which happens annually, where some designers are selected to present a showcase of the key learning that they had from that entire year working on any kind of business project. So there are certain context requirements here, where one was that this is something that will be presented virtually to encompass audiences from different parts of the globe. The second aspect was that the story needed to be fitted within a maximum of 5 to 5.5 minutes. There needed to be references which could be understood globally. It need not be rooted in just, say, an Indian context or in any kind of specific cultural context. And at the same time, you would want your humor, your quirks, your nuances that you introduce to be accessible to people who might not even know what that product is or what that team is or what the project I was working on was. So I'll just share this. It might feel a bit like storyception because it's a story within a story where I was trying to explain rather how storytelling could be pursued. Let's just get started.
Reporting live from Adobe Design News broadcast, as there has been a shocking unfolding of events which have led to what appears to be an unfortunate yet fierce clash between some of our valuable employees. From footage captured on the site a day ago, there seems to be quite a heated and intense situation at hand in between design and the engineering stakeholders collaborating on a project. Here is a quick glimpse for you for the events which were caught on camera yesterday night. The visible tension brewing between the involved parties is certainly a matter of concern. And our team of reporters are on site with continuous updates on the matter. Hello? All right, okay, so we'll quickly be shifting to the live cameras at the scene of the events right now, as there seems to be an exclusive and major real time update from the location. Wait, what just happened here? Well, hello to everyone at Adobe Design. I'm Sahil R, a user experience designer on AEM Assets in Experience Cloud. My pronouns are he, him, and if you're dialing in, I'm a brown guy with black hair and I wear specs. I've been part of the design team for 2 years now and mainly work out of the Noida office in India. That said, I'm here to share with you all the story of what really transpired behind the scenes of what you just saw.
It all began on a project that I was part of called Content Hub, which at that time was known as the Asset Distribution Portal. Building an entire portal experience from zero to one, we got to innovate and explore by designing components and feature flows from scratch. One such component was the asset card. As design, I advocated strongly for the asset card to have selective asset related information and actions on the card itself. Reason being the focus on the use case at hand, where our users browsed through assets, selected them depending on associated information such as the campaign name, to quote an example, and then downloaded or shared them. Though the engineering leadership involved had a contrary opinion where they strongly felt that the card should just have the asset thumbnail, as that would have made the browse experience look and feel more lightweight and stylish. With the reasons having fair logic on both sides, none of us seemed to budge. And this back and forth ended up continuing for weeks, getting more and more intense. It came to a point where the lack of a consensus and direction started to become a blocker for all of us in moving forward. It started to look like what you saw at the beginning, until one day there was a realization that among all the different voices in the room, the most important one was actually not even being heard. What do our users really want? Why don't we just go and ask them directly? My design manager at the time, Tanya Jain, sparked this thought in me. With the project being part of the VIP customers program, we already did have access to our customers who were being looped in at different stages of the project for reviews and alignment. But this seemed like the perfect opportunity to actually leverage the luxury of this access. Following a consultation from Mike Henderson of the ADRS, I proposed this idea to the larger team, and everyone was quickly on board. I created a contextual user research framework called Building with You, with the idea of allowing our users to be part of creating what they would be using in the future. A three pillared framework focusing on having our users ponder, answer, and then choose. In the presence of the engineering and product stakeholders, I conducted sessions with users from five different client companies. Each session included asking questions related to the component and use case, walking them through prototypes of three different design options, and then getting their immediate thoughts, feedback, and preference. As the sessions came to a conclusion, 100% of the users expressed their preference for the same exact asset card option. The voice that mattered the most was heard, and the direction became clearer than ever. Not only did this solve for the difference of opinions at that moment, but also became a framework that we went back to several times during the course of the project. We learned that in collaboration, the one magic spell that triumphs everything else and beautifully brings us all together is the question: what do our users want?
Yep. So that was an example of how you could apply the entire idea of shaping a plot line into an applicable context. And this is always like one of my favorite examples to go back to, because often in design, or often as any corporate employee, right, there are these questions that come up that when you're part of a high intensity environment where you're dealing with timelines, you're dealing with requirements, you're dealing with, say, project collaborators, stakeholders, leadership, and so on, it can start to feel overwhelming. But at the same time, does that mean that you have to templatize the kind of presentations that you create? Does that mean that you can templatize, say, coming up with a corporate presentation, or making things just to the point, only talking about data, only talking about numbers? No. While that is important, it is also important, even more so as designers, to stick true to your own voice, the voice that makes you unique. And that is also where we combine the first chapter as we transition into the second one, where we'll just start by looking at this particular image on the screen. So there are two ways to describe this particular visual, right? One of the descriptions is that this is a black and white depiction of, say, a scenery where there are a lot of trees. There is an open sky with a lot of stars. You could spot some shooting stars going by. There is a reflection of this entire scenery at the bottom through the lake, where you could see a symmetrical representation of this entire frame. Now, this was a very objective way of describing this. What if instead of this, the second way is where I talk about how this is not actually any random video that I found online, but was a video that I captured 4 years ago when I, for the very first time in my life, got to experience the beauty of stargazing. This was for the very first time when I went with a couple of friends, or a couple of very special friends of mine, to this place in India called the Tirthan Valley, where amidst midnight we all walked away. We trekked towards this very beautiful destination, where the only thing that you could spot was darkness. The only thing that you could feel was cold. But as you looked up, there was this surreal, magical experience of seeing shooting stars. And as much as I imagine throughout my life of how anytime I see a shooting star, this is the wish that I would go. This is the wish that I would make. The very fascinating bit is that when you actually get to experience it, it is so overwhelming that you completely lose thought of making a wish. It's just being encapsulated and being captivated by that exact moment, being present in that moment. So it's again the same exact visual, but this just suddenly feels a little more colorful, right? What exactly adds this element of color? That is where we get to the second chapter, or the second P, which is that of poetry. When I say poetry, am I referring to just words that sound crafty? Am I just referring to words that are rhyming with each other? Not at all. When I refer to poetry, I am referring to the tool that can allow you as an individual to stand out, for you to break the monotony, and for like allowing for your voice to shine through, for you to embrace what makes you unique, what makes you stand out from the rest. And to achieve that, what is important as designers is to not just look at what happened, but to look at what happened and how did that impact you. What is your personal experience of any occurrence that happened? It's important to not just state facts in a story, but to talk about what was the result or the impact of those facts. So, which is exactly why anytime you're creating a portfolio, you're creating a presentation for your own faculty, what would resonate more is not just say information that you found online as part of research. It would not just be numbers, it would not just be data visualization, but at the same time, what would add an element of magic to it, an element of making it even more humane, even more engaging, is what was the project for you? What was your journey through it? What were the challenges that you faced? How did you overcome those challenges? What were the different design decisions that you got to take? For example, in something as simple as a freelance project where you as a graphic designer were working with a client to come up with logos, if you had 10 different options of logos, what made you choose this one to go forward, and what was the entire story behind that? It is important to identify the core movements that define that entire project, the core movements that identify that entire journey, and to talk about that, to mold the entire series of events or series of occurrences into your own perspective. And while you do that, another aspect of making your stories poetic is to know that there are innumerable mediums that you can utilize to share your story. While we as designers often refer to as that, okay, I just have to create a screen, I might have to just create a visual, the amount of mediums that are available to us or the amount of tools that are available to us are actually infinite. How do you exactly tap into identifying those? Is by looking within, by seeking what are your own passions, not just as a designer, but also as an individual. It is very fascinating to note that as designers, you always have the leeway of intermingling your passions outside of work into your work as well. Whether it is performative arts like singing, dancing, using puppets, magic shows, any of these mediums could very innovatively be utilized as a form of presenting or as a form of medium that you want to use to share your story. While the more common ideas are those of coming up with a comic strip, coming up with an illustration, coming up with a painting, it can even be scaled up to the examples that I was referring to earlier. You might all be wondering, but how does this even make sense? How would a performative art make sense as a presentation for design, right? And that is what brings me to an example of what I, as a student, as a design student, went through a couple of years ago, where one of our professors in this subject called designing for people asked the entire class, which was of 55 students, to go to Chandni Chowk, which is a flea market in Delhi, and come back and share what was each of our experiences. Now, as diverse, as unique as 55 different students, 55 different minds could be, at the end of it, they are being subjected to the same exact stimuli, the same exact experience. How exactly could you make the narration of that same experience different? That is what prompted me. It was so the entire day we were at Chandni Chowk. We had to come back in the evening, and the next morning is when we had to come up with the presentation. And there were very like different ideas that I was also playing around with. Could it be through photographs? Could it be through a presentation? Maybe I create a video. And at the same time, I was just wondering, but how do I exactly stand out, right? And this was a time in my life where I was like getting started to drawn towards this art form of rap music. I started to listen to a lot of Hindi rap. The Desi hip hop scene as we know it today started popping a little more. And I was just curious, what if I try to go a different route and come up with a rap of my own to describe that entire experience? The next day, after getting done with the entire rap throughout the entire night, this was the very first time where I was trying to come up with a detailed, thorough way of using an art form like music to present something which was otherwise work related, right? And as nervous and excited as I was at the same time, the next morning when I went ahead and presented it to the class, there were just hoots and cheers, and everybody just thoroughly enjoyed it. There was so much appreciation that I got. And when I later thought about it, it was definitely not because of the quality or the technical brilliance or anything of the rap, because it was not good at all in terms of the technicalities. But why it resonated with the audience was because everybody knew that this was something that I felt passionate about. Rap was something that I, as an individual, identified with, and that was something that was unique to me. The fact that I took the step of coming up with something which otherwise people would not expect as a college presentation is what prompted that kind of a response. I'll just share like a very small glimpse of that video. Again, just pardon the lack of it being a good song, but just refer to it for it being like a unique method of leveraging stories. Just share this. Yep. शाहजहां की पुकार यहाँ अल्लाह की आजान में है, शिव यहाँ दुर्गा भी, राम का भी नाम है, जीसस ईसाई उनकी बरकत कमाल भी है, शीश गंज गुरु तेज का गुमान भी है, दिगंबर लाल जैन मंदिर भी महान ही है, मस्जिद जानुमा यहाँ ईद का भी चांद है, चर्च गुरुद्वारा यहाँ मंदिर का भी नाम, आरती की गूंज में अजान की पुकार भी है, प्रसाद की मिठास में लंगर की भी आस, उतारे जूतों के साथ सर पे कपड़े का लिबास भी है, किरपान भी, बुरखा भी, जनेऊ का मान भी है, सबका आन भी, जान भी, आने पे आवान भी, हिंदू मुसलमान नहीं सब इंसान भी है, सब भगवान भी है, सब इंसान भी है, सब भगवान भी है, रंगों के इस मेले में सफेद आसमान भी है, सफेद आसमान भी है, पेट पूजा नहीं दूजा कोई खाने का भंडार, यहाँ स्वाद, यहाँ भूख और पकवानों का त्योहार, यहाँ मिठास की बहार, यहाँ मसालों का पहाड़, यहाँ शरबत मोहब्बत का गुलाबी अवतार, करीम की बिरयानी का मसालेदार निसार, मसाले की खुशबू से सजा ये बाजार, पराठे वाली गली में वो बिखरा सा प्यार, असलम के चिकन पे लगी वो कतार भी, जलेबियाँ लस्सी और समोसे का दुलार भी, काका जी के ढाबे की दाल का बुखार भी, मिठाई की दुकानों पे सजे अरमान भी, सफेद पन्ने पे बिखरे रंगों का त्योहार भी, इंसानियत मोहब्बत और विविधता में प्यार भी, इंसानियत मोहब्बत विविधता में प्यार भी. Yeah, there are two more verses which continue in a similar manner, but just a minute, I think I stopped sharing the screen. But that, as an example, just depicts how it's not just about coming up with this something that is very refined, that is technically brilliant, but it's just something that is unique to you, something that depicts your perspective, your uniqueness as an individual, that highlights how you as an individual are different, right? And yep. So, which is exactly where you can utilize n number of different passions and leverage them as different mediums for sharing stories. But at the same time, while your own stories can be very personal, it can come from a place of something which is very true to yourself. It is also very important for them to still not lose out on conveying what you intended to the audience at hand, which is where, as part of the same poetry, comes another nuance, which is that of gathering feedback. So always surround yourself with people that whose opinions you respect, whose craft excites you, you who know with whom you can feel comfortable sharing your work and getting their feedback to better refine it, to better make your story more accessible to different perceptions. And it can range from being somebody like your colleague to a peer in the student group to your own parents, siblings, grandparents, because at the end of it, stories are for everybody. And what that allows you as a storyteller is to make sure that whatever you are wanting to convey gets conveyed to more amount of people and more kinds of people. And what this allows you to achieve is that at the very core, while your story will be completely yours, it is going to be completely true to you as an individual. Your voice is what forms the very crux of that narrative. It is still going to have the ability to reflect colors that can be perceived and understood by everybody in the audience. Now, this is exactly where we get concluded to of the second chapter, and we move towards the third one, where I did just refer to how there are n number of different mediums that you can utilize, right? But in today's day and age where there is so much content around us, there is one particular medium that triumphs everything else. Now, does this mean that you can completely rely on this one medium? Definitely not. But having this as part of your narratives, having this as part of your stories, can add or elevate the amount of delight that the audience might feel after going through your presentation, your story, and that entire experience to feel more connected to it. What exactly is this one medium? The medium that triumphs all others in today's day and age is that of visuals, anything that is for the eye, which is where we come to our third chapter, which is known as pixels. When we say pixels, again, as metaphorical as poetry was, even pixels does not refer to only digital graphics. It can be anything that is visual, whether it is, say, a painting, an illustration, a doodle, a wireframe that you sketched out on a notepad, to even a mind map that you want to come up with. As textual as it may seem, at the end of it, as a visual, it allows you to communicate your idea more effectively. It can even be more, say, dynamic forms of visuals that can be animations, video editing, composition. When you talk about user experience design, it can be micro interactions. And there are several different examples throughout history or even in pop culture, as what we'll be going through in this case, to better understand of how visuals as a medium can triumph all other mediums, or how visuals are a very important and integral part of driving stories forward. The very first example that we look at is this part of a script that you will be seeing in the front, which is an interaction between two different characters, Gordon and the Joker. Now, I'd love for you all to just read through it, and while you do it, try to imagine what exactly is this referring to. Now, while to some it might have clicked, it might have painted a picture in their minds. To some, they might be wondering, what exactly is this? Is this from some comic? Is this the Joker from DC? What is going on here, right? But on the other hand, if instead of showing you this text, I showed you this particular video and paused at this exact instance, you would all be able to remember very vividly, if you've seen the movie, what happens after this. What happens right after you can spot Batman in the background of the Joker? How does this entire conversation pan out? This entire visual from The Dark Knight by Christopher Nolan is a very iconic one. Reason being that even if you say don't remember the entirety of the story, there are certain visuals which get retained in your memory. Reason being that the human brain has a higher tendency to remember and to store visuals as memory than it does for text, sound, or any other medium. Which is exactly why visuals enable for your stories to have higher retention and higher memorability. On the other hand, another more contemporary example is this, where you could read that this is an interaction where somebody called Steve is trying to attack Thanos, who's the Mad Titan. And yep, you can read through it. And towards the end, it talks about how the Mjolnir starts to float off the ground while Thanos is digging it into Thor. Now, again, some people might have already a picture in mind, some people might be wondering, but there is no way that this same text could create the same amount of impact or the same level of impact as this visual did when all of us got to witness the Avengers Endgame for the very first time in theaters, right? It was not just because it was a community experience, but what was fascinating about it was that same visual can impact so many people in the audience in the same exact manner. The fact that visuals have the potential to impact or to create emotional impact in a manner which is a little more elevated than all other mediums is something to take note of. Which is exactly why, if the same visual was something that was being, say, looked at a comic, it would have been very impactful, but it would have still been more of an individualistic experience, right? Because one person at that point is the audience to that comic. On the other hand, a visual like this, which is at this scale, allows for the same experience to be multiplied and to be experienced at the same level to multiple audiences. Now, the third example is of this lyric of this song called Agar Tum Saath Ho. This is from one of my favorite movies from Indian cinema called Tamasha. Now, you might read through the lyrics and it might again bring, you might be humming the song. But at the same time, if instead of just going through these lyrics and just listening to that song, if yep, this to the lyrics that we were otherwise going through, this just suddenly seems a lot more immersive, right? Reason being that the same visual now has a lot more tools at play. It has color, it has expressions, it has movement, it has visualizations of characters. There is correlation of the physicality of characters to each other. And all of that makes that entire experience more holistic than just one medium would have. Which is exactly why we talk about not just, it's not just that the visual by itself can do the job, but as an additional element that can always elevate the experience multifold. And to the fourth example, which is that of this lyric, where it reads, cause ever since I left the city, you started wearing less and going out more. As problematic as it may sound, you might be wondering if you know of this lyric or not, but it is actually the same part of that music video from Drake for Hotline Bling, where this exact scene pops up. Now, a majority of the people, whenever I've presented this, have remembered that lyric, but everybody remembers this particular scene because of how it's become very iconographic in the meme culture, in the pop culture, through social media, to a point where now a lot of people I can even see using these as part of presentations to just highlight how something is what they would prefer in comparison to something that they wouldn't. And this is also a great example of how visuals can also break barriers of accessibility. The same visual or the same song, which was otherwise in English, is now translating to people who might not even understand English by just referring to this particular visual, right? They could still understand and gauge what this means, what as a meme this translates to. And the final example is that of the McDonald's clown, where we'll just go through like a bit of an activity where just think out loud to yourself. When I say the McDonald's clown, is this the image that you paint in your minds? Or is it this one? Or maybe this? Not really, right? Whenever you hear the word the McDonald's clown, this is what pops up in your minds. Reason being that a lot of brands have started now leveraging user psychology by looking at visuals to make visuals a part of their identity. You can refer to logos, mascots, the kind of colors that certain brands use. Whenever, for example, you think of McDonald's, the colors that come to your mind are yellow and red. Whenever you hear the McDonald's clown or the Ronald McDonald clown, you always paint this picture in your mind. What this allows for is that the same concept can become a lot more vivid in the audience's mind. And for customer engagement, a lot of brands end up utilizing visuals to make sure that their brand has a very unique identity that can be remembered and that can be more resonant amongst audiences. And which is exactly where any kind of a story which is for the eye is what makes that story iconic. Just to refer to another example of how I've personally applied a similar learning in one of my projects, was how in when I joined Adobe, the very first project that I got to work on was around market research on a product that I was working on, right? That was to better understand the product. And after going through 1 month of, say, different competitors, gathering a lot of insights, gathering a lot of documentation, Miro boards, Figma files, and so on and so forth, The first draft of the presentation that I came up with was very textual, because in my head, I thought that there is so much information that I gathered, and it is important for me to translate that information to all the audiences, whether it's the leadership, my stakeholders, my design manager, for them to understand, okay, this is why this is what we need in our product. And once I did that, I realized that that felt, or that could feel to the audience, very overwhelming, right? And one of my mentors, design mentors at that point, shared how I could, instead of leveraging just a lot of textual information, be more innovative by rather referring to, say, a visual metaphor for depicting the same information. And after exploring a couple of different options, the one that I went ahead was something like this, where for each of the different sections, I came up with a meme to highlight how the insight that I gathered was relevant. So, for example, in this case, I wanted to talk about how for our users, they don't want to just refer to as data as numbers, right? In our product, they just don't want to see data as infographics. A little better would have been to see data as infographics that are also interactive. But the ideal goal would have been to have data that is interactive infographics, but at the same time can be reported or filtered. Now, otherwise, the same information, if I wanted to document it, would have been very textual. It would have included examples of references, different products, and so on. But while the presentation still had some of that, just starting out with a visual or a meme like this made it more snackable and made it more consumable for the audiences to understand what exactly am I referring to here. And getting back to the presentation, where we talked about these are the kind of visuals that can make a presentation iconic, right? This is exactly where we conclude the concept of the three P's, which is that of plot lines, poetry, and pixels, which is my answer to the art of crafting captivating narratives. At the same time, I want to highlight that while this is my answer, it can be adapted by a lot of different designers, a lot of different individuals. But at the same time, they can mold this framework into what works best for them. They can mold the same framework to identify what is the medium that I feel most passionately about. What are the different ways in which I can make my story unique? What are the kind of visuals that I personally feel comfortable exploring? Do I feel excited about the idea of exploring micro animations, video compositing, or is it character sketches, mascot design, graphics, just a visual experience altogether? And what allows for you, if you understand storytelling as a designer, is for you to leverage it as a superpower. Storytelling as a tool is something that allows you to multiply and magnify the impact of your work by several folds. You're not just creating, you're not just sharing thoughts, but at the same time you are feeling able to and feeling more confident in talking about those concepts and taking it to wider audiences. You feel more confident in highlighting why that concept is of relevance, why that concept is of value, why the project that you worked on felt meaningful and fulfilling to you as an individual. And which is exactly where we have stories as power ups, which can be applied into different contexts, right? Whether we talk about presentations as design students, as interns, as colleagues, as people who are in the corporate industry, you are always required to come up with presentations for different audiences with different purposes. It might be for a showcase to a large group of designers where you want to share your learnings. It might be with the leadership where you just want to highlight how something that you worked on is solving a certain problem. But how, for within that presentation, within that context, do you make your story shine? Similarly, for project documentation, when we say project documentation, one part of it is presentations, but another part of it is also, say, portfolios. When we talk about portfolio, another element or another contextual nuance that you have to refer to is that in that case, me as a designer or me as a creator of that project would not be present to talk about what is this entire story about, right? For example, if I have created a portfolio project on Behance, on Medium, or on my own portfolio website, if somebody is going through that in their own time, I am not present in that moment to talk about it in parallel. Then it becomes an onus on me as an individual to make sure that the message is still being conveyed to them, where probably I include more text, I include more explanatory visuals, more infographics, so that even if I am not present, whoever is going through that project documentation is able to understand what I wanted to convey. Then the third one is that of interviews, where at any stage in life, no matter how senior you are or if you're starting out, you will always be privy to the concept of giving interviews. It is important for you as an individual to be able to talk about why you are a valuable asset to any institution that you're applying to, what sets you apart, what makes you unique, and what is, say, a set of skills that you are bringing to the table that can differentiate you from others. Why are you a valuable asset to that team, right? And then that of stakeholder management. So this is something that we often in design education don't talk about a lot, but when you're actually in the industry or in corporate, this is a very, very integral part of you when we talk about designers, right? Because often as designers we hear the concept of how you have to always advocate for the users, you have to advocate for user centricity. As romantic as that concept sounds, or as poetic as it sounds, it is actually what you have to do when you're partnering with different stakeholders. You have to always advocate for you what you feel is the right experience, what you feel is going to be right for the customers, for the users. You have to be an advocate, and for you to for you to talk about why your rationale makes sense, why is it something that will bring in value to the customers and make the product a better experience altogether. And finally, the entire idea of applying it into personal expression, where it's not always just about work, it's not always just about, say, assignments, your job, applying for interviews, presentations, but just as an individual. Humans have always been very social beings. Stories have always fulfilled and felt like a form of magic to humans, because that allows for them to transcend history, right? The same mythological stories that we hear today are the ones that were written years and years ago. Though at that point, probably the medium might have been vocal instead of it being verbal, or instead of it being written, instead of it being showcased as movies. But because those stories were expressed at that point, is why we are able to extract learnings from them, why we are able to immerse ourselves in those experiences even now. And this is what brings us towards the end of this entire conversation, where I wanted to highlight how this entire concept, this entire idea of storytelling is something which is a product of passion for me. It is something that I feel very strongly about, and it is something that comes from the heart. And as designers, I cannot emphasize enough upon the importance of storytelling as a tool in your toolkit, and something that can elevate your skill set and elevate your differentiation as a designer in the market. And I'd like to just close this entire conversation by bringing up this quote, which reads that amidst the alleys of spun tales, the real and surreal we find, where words woven like magic paint the realms of mind. The reason why I felt this quote is something of relevance is because when, for the very first time, I was documenting this entire presentation or this entire talk, towards the very end, I was a bit curious about what if I try to leverage ChatGPT or just leverage any AI tool to come up with poetry, right? Because I've always personally been fascinated by poetry, proses, quotes. But what if, and I've always been more of a traditionalist where I felt that no, it has to come from a very humanistic expression. But at the same time, with the evolving technology, I realized that my interest or passion in AI could also be leveraged into intermingling that with my idea of storytelling, which is what brings us to also the concept of poetry, right? How you can find your passions, your interests, which in today's time can even be emerging technology like AI. So this, in a way, I would not say AI authored it, rather I would say AI co-authored it with me, allowing for my thoughts to be translated into what you see in front of you right now. Because it's always going to be a back and forth, it's always going to feel like a conversation. But even emerging technologies can be utilized very innovatively, very inventively, and very creatively as mediums of storytelling. And that is what brings us to the very conclusion. And again, thank you so much for everyone for joining in. It was nothing short of a pleasure and nothing short of an absolute joy to share this with all of you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sahil. That was such a refreshing take on storytelling. I'm so happy that I've been part of this session today. I feel so much joy, and I feel like my life or my day is a little bit richer now. So thank you for sharing all your experiences and insights on design and storytelling in general. We already have a bunch of questions. I will open the floor to questions, but we'll keep it a bit short because we're running out of time. But please put in your questions in the Q&A box so that we can answer them systematically. So Yamini is asking, this is really interesting how you have inculcated so many mediums in your storytelling. In day-to-day office life or even back in college, did you have to face any audiences that did not agree to the idea of you innovating and experimenting for presentations and preferred traditional mediums instead? If yes, how did you tackle such situations or innovate regardless of
Thank you so much for sharing that question first and foremost, Yamini. That's a very, very valid and justified question. And in fact, this was also one of the thoughts that I earlier had, especially in corporate, not so much in college. Because in college, you're often given a lot more freedom, a lot more liberation in terms of exploring your own voice, doing projects in your own way. There will be certain cases where you have to abide by certain objective principles. So, for example, a concept like ergonomics might not be where you get to play with a lot of subjectivity of expression. But at the same time, when even when you're talking about concepts which are otherwise objective, you can, as a storyteller, add in an element of delight through very little things, right? So, for example, even if we go back to the example of cognitive ergonomics, if that is an objective framework that you're talking about or an assignment that you conducted, how do you probably add examples or quotations of the users that you tested it with? You bring in personal anecdotes, you bring in images, photographs, videos. And even in case of corporate, one very tricky bit is to first identify what the audience is. There might be cases where, for example, if I have to present to the leadership, there might be a very small or a very short amount of time where I have to convey a lot of information, which is exactly where now I start to self reflect on my end that, okay, if I just have 2 minutes to share my impact in this project, what is it that I want to prioritize the most? Is it the element of delight, or is it the impact that I got to create? If it is the impact that I got to create, then I start by highlighting that. And then slowly, towards a lower amount of priority, I try to sieve in smaller elements of delight through, say, very small top, like using a visual metaphor, using quotations, like I was earlier saying. So it's, again, you always have to dabble between situations, and it's more about adapting to different audiences, which even makes it even more exciting.
Yeah, and context is always more important. Your college audiences might still entertain more delight, but when you're talking to, like, say, senior management or C-suite, you want to, like, again, adapt for that sort of an audience and context. So thank you for answering that, Sahil. Um, so somebody's asking, when you're designing at Adobe, do you actually think of it as storytelling or does it happen naturally?
So there are two parts to it. So when you're designing a user experience, right, there, like with every different stage of design, you have to wear a different hat in a way. There is a stage in the entire process where I might want to wear the hat of a researcher, where my key focus is to identify observations, bring in insights. The next hat that I might want to wear is that of an explorer, right, where now want to come up with different explorations of solving that particular problem, brainstorming, ideating, wireframing, and so on and so forth. There might be cases where I have to be a stakeholder manager. But the hat of storytelling is something that you start to wear when you have to now present that entire project that you've completed, or maybe in the middle of the project you have to showcase it to, say, stakeholders or to the leadership, to share what is the kind of progress that you made. Again, going back to what even Shubhangi mentioned, right, that it context in a way is king. If that context demands or allows for me to be explorative with my storytelling, definitely I would want to spend more time and invest more time into adding more micro animations. For example, the audience that we were interacting with today, that is an audience where this element of delight is something which would definitely be more resonant, right? On the other hand, if it was an audience of leadership where they just want to understand the impact more clearly, that would be my priority. So yeah, at different stages you have to wear different hats.
Right. And somebody's asking, just give me a moment. Do you ever worry about making a story too complicated or fancy and losing clarity?
Most definitely. In fact, like anytime I'm coming up with a narrative, because personally I'm somebody who feels more inclined towards words that are more crafty or adding a bit more philosophy, metaphors to my stories. And one step in my story creation that I always make sure to go through is to have some layer of feedback, where in my head maybe this metaphor made a lot of sense. If I take that through a layer of feedback through, say, three people of different kinds, maybe somebody at home, somebody at office, some friend, unless it's around NDA. If it is NDA, then probably different people within the same organization, right? If I wet this with different audiences, now I start to understand that, oh, in my head this might have made sense, but in actuality it doesn't translate as effectively. In those cases, then you try to adapt. But in a lot of cases, you might even feel validated that, oh, what made sense in my head is also translating effectively. So it's always going to be a very rewarding experience to have feedback circles in that.
Right. And somebody's asking, how do you deal with situations where stakeholders don't get the story you're trying to tell?
So with stakeholders, a lot of the times, in fact, more often than not, it is less about creating an element of delight. It is more about conveying information, which is where there I would rather refer to the story arc of or a plot line of that of an explanation or a report, right? Where I just want cut to cut information to be conveyed, where I want them to be informed of, okay, these are the updates that I made. Because when you talk about stakeholder management, that is an engagement that you have to do on a day-to-day basis. So on a day-to-day basis, they would want to be more efficient and more agile with the kind of progress that we are making, right? So there again, you prioritize that this is the information that I want to create, this is the information that I want to share. On the other hand, more like philosophy or making it more, say, storytelling driven would happen in cases of a showcase, in cases of a pitch, where also there are certain cases where people from cross functions might be available in the same showcase. There might be from people from design, engineering, and PM, which is exactly where you make sure that your the kind of words that you use are not very technical, or not very jargony, that okay, maybe only designers will be able to understand that effectively.
Right. Um, Somebody's asking, okay, this is, I think you must get this a lot, but when you applied to Adobe, what do you think stood out in your portfolio the most?
So I feel like that what I personally felt the most confident in my portfolio with was that it was a very clear representation of what I was as an individual and what I was as a designer. So there are different schools of thoughts around it, but I've always believed that before creating that portfolio, right, what I did was I spent a couple of months into making sure that whatever I put out is the most refined and the best possible version of what I could have achieved at that point, with the number of experience that I had as of then, the amount of learnings that I had as of then. So I wanted to make sure that whatever goes out is its most refined self. That is one. The second thing was that the kind of projects that I used to showcase my skill set in the portfolio were all in a way reflections of something that genuinely mattered to me. So, for example, there were projects which were very user experience centric, but even if there were user experience centric, there was more of an experiential design flavor to it. It wasn't just a UI UX app, which can be considered a very templatized format of approaching it, right? There was more attention to also the visual experience of that entire thing. There was more thoroughness in documentation, and at the end of it, it is always about one, being thorough, but second, also making sure that it is a very clear representation of you, because whoever is on the other side, because for them it is a very frequent job of going through different resumes, different portfolios, different projects. It is very easy for them to see through if something is very templatized and if it's something that's not coming from within. So it's important to just be genuine with whatever you're coming together with.
Right. Himshika is asking, Adobe products are used by millions, so how do you even begin to tell stories for such a huge audience?
So even when you're, I think Himshika is like, here you're referring to the entire idea of how even designing is very synonymous to storytelling, right? Which is partly true. Like even when you're creating experiences for the users, what's at the forefront is to be empathetic to the users, right? To always have that concept of empathy inculcated in you. Again, this is something which can sound very holier than thou. It can sound very preachy, because it is something that we always heard from our faculty, from our professors. But as a designer, it does make a lot of difference, because as soon as you feel more empathetic, right, any design decision that I'm taking, whether it is something as simple as the placement of a button to the kind of text that I am using, should it be start, should it be click to start, even that, if I'm paying more attention to, if I am the user, how would I interact with it, double questioning that, triple questioning that, asking people around me how they feel about this as an experience, it is what makes sure that the experience that you're creating is accessible. Because when you're creating with an audience that wide, with a set of users who come in from very different backgrounds, different proficiencies, accessibility is what guides you towards creating an experience that is the most well-rounded. At the same time, it's also important to refer to existing frameworks like what WCAG has for accessibility. Similarly, when you're working as part of a bigger ecosystem, it's important to refer to the design system that that company has, to make sure that whatever you're coming up with is in line with those principles, that kind of ideology, and so on.
Okay. Somebody is asking, storytelling in portfolios often feels like a very linear problem, a linear process and a linear solution. Do you think there's space for more cinematic or non-linear storytelling in design portfolios?
So I feel like this is also again on like it's a bit of a bias that exists in people's mind that storytelling in portfolios has to be linear. It really isn't that. It's in fact far from that. If, for example, somebody on the other side, if I'm going through a portfolio, if I see a portfolio where somebody has put in the effort of coming up with a unique format of presenting the same information, whether it is a unique format of, say, not just writing data, but rather using an infographic, that just shows that they've put more thought into it, right? To something even more abstract as coming up with an opening video, something that is a little more jazzy than just a textual introduction, something where you're highlighting the impact through user interviews, having pictures of them. In fact, what I'll also do is I'll share a link to my portfolio. It's a little outdated. It's from the time of when I created that in college, but you could even refer to some of the project documentations that I have done there as a point of reference. Where one of my, in fact, key goals with every project was to make sure that I bring in an element of delight. I bring in videos, animations, micro animations, and so on.
Right. So yeah, and this is something that I've also come across a lot, many designers do, which is um get lost in the like they get lost in the I want to say like a lot many portfolio templates exist and they want to show breadth of work, and then in that template their authenticity sort of gets lost. So to just like also figure out the presentation and the kind of projects, as you mentioned, that what is it the kind of projects that you want to show will also show the kind of uh, leaning you have in the whole big gamut of design world and the realm. So yeah, I think agree. Um, I think with that, we've reached the end of the questions. I usually like to close this session with the question that I personally like asking all of my speakers. Sahil, so if you were to redesign something, something maybe as small as a safety pin and as big as the metro railway system, what would you redesign?
That's a very interesting question. I feel like there is great scope in redesigning or re-envisioning the educational experience, and I'm here not referring to just say the Indian context, but the entire idea of how education can be made a lot more creatively exciting for the students. So, for example, I've never personally been able to develop a habit of reading text, like reading books other than textbooks that I had in college, school. But I feel like I fill in that void by going through a lot of visual content. I go through a lot of podcasts. I go through a lot of videos, and there are different people and they have different affinities of learning, right? It is important for teaching, education, pedagogy in general to be more adaptive and to allow for it to be more user centric, again, for lack of a better word, because that is what will allow not just for better learning but also more excitement in the students or in the kids to feel excited, like more enthusiastic about the idea of learning something new.
That's a great answer. Thank you so much, Sahil, for doing this with us. Thank you to all of our audience members who stuck around till the end of the session. I know it's a little late, but thank you for spending the time with us today evening. With that, I will close the session and I will see you around in class. Thank you and bye bye and good night.
Thanks, everyone.